Imagine standing at the intersection of 34th Street and 5th Avenue. It is a crisp autumn morning in 1946. You look up, expecting to see the chaotic bustle of a victorious New York. Instead, a heavy, suffocating silence hangs over Manhattan, broken only by the rhythmic, grinding drone of 6-engine aircraft patrolling the cloud layer above. As your eyes trace the limestone facade of the Empire State Building, you don't see the stars and stripes fluttering from the dirigible mast. You see crimson. A massive banner, 4 stories tall, unfurls in the stiff Atlantic breeze, bearing the black hooked cross. Down on the street, the yellow taxis are gone. In their place, gray Kubel wagons idle at the curb. The NYPD isn't directing traffic. Men in field gray trench coats, the Feld Gendarmerie, are checking papers at a checkpoint outside Macy's. This isn't a fever dream. This is the timeline where the Atlantic Ocean stopped being a moat and became a highway for the Third Reich. The United States, once the untouchable fortress of democracy, has become the final trophy. The war didn't end in the bunker in Berlin. It ended here, on Broadway.
We often comfort ourselves with the idea that the Atlantic Ocean was an invulnerable shield. We imagine a 3,000-mile moat that separated the industrial horrors of the European front from the quiet suburban safety of the American home front. We believe that while London burned and Stalingrad starved, America remained a sanctuary, untouched by the physical devastation of total war. But that sense of safety was an illusion. In early 1942, that shield didn't just crack, it was smashed open. Consider the first 6 months of 1942. This period, known to German U-boat crews as the Second Happy Time, saw the Kriegsmarine launch Unternehmen Paukenschlag, Operation Drumbeat. The objective wasn't just to sink tonnage, it was to psychologically terrorize the American populace, and it worked. 5 U-boats arrived off the East Coast in January. They found a country completely unprepared for modern naval warfare. Coastal cities like New York, Atlantic City, and Miami hadn't even enforced blackouts. The neon glow of hotels and boardwalks silhouetted merchant ships perfectly against the night sky, turning them into shooting gallery targets for German torpedoes. The devastation was visible from the shore. Tourists sipping coffee on the veranda of a Florida hotel could look out to the horizon and see the burning wreckage of oil tankers. Debris and oil slicks washed up on the pristine sands of Virginia Beach. Bodies of merchant sailors drifted into the surf at Cape Hatteras. This wasn't a distant war anymore. The enemy was literally swimming in American waters. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander of the U-boat fleet, wrote in his logs that the Americans were remarkably unwarlike in their defenses. He was right. The U.S. Navy was stretched thin, guarding convoys to Britain, leaving the eastern seaboard virtually undefended. At one point, there were more German submarines hunting off the coast of New Jersey than there were American destroyers available to hunt them. But the Germans didn't just stay in the water, they came ashore. In June 1942, U-202 surfaced off Amagansett, New York, right on Long Island. Under the cover of fog, 4 German saboteurs rowed ashore in a rubber dinghy. They buried their uniforms in the sand, donned civilian suits, and walked into town to catch a train to New York City. 4 more landed near Jacksonville, Florida. This was Operation Pastorius. Their mission wasn't invasion, but crippling sabotage. They carried explosives disguised as lumps of coal, intending to blow up hydroelectric plants at Niagara Falls, aluminum factories in Illinois, and major railroad bridges like the Hell Gate Bridge in New York. While these men were eventually caught due to a betrayal within their own ranks, the terrifying reality remains. German military assets had successfully breached the American coastline, infiltrated American cities, and walked among American civilians. This is where we find our pivot character for this timeline, General Henry Hap Arnold, the commanding general of the U.S. Air Forces. In our history, Arnold was a man of supreme confidence, focused entirely on building the bomber fleets that would level Germany. But in the private moments of 1942, as reports of burning tankers and landed spies reached his desk, a different emotion took hold: anxiety. Arnold knew something the public didn't. He knew that the Atlantic was shrinking. He knew that aviation technology was advancing at a rate that would soon make the ocean irrelevant. While the public feared the U-boats, Arnold feared what was coming next. He feared the Amerikabomber. The Reich Air Ministry, the RLM, had seen the future. In 1942, they issued a 33-page document, a request for a strategic bomber capable of a round-trip flight from Europe to the United States with a payload of 6,500 kilograms. This wasn't a fantasy project sketched on a napkin. Major German manufacturers like Messerschmitt, Junkers, and Henkel were actively building prototypes. The Messerschmitt Me 264 was real. It had a wingspan of 141 feet. It had the range to reach New York City from bases in France. It flew its first mission in December 1942. Hap Arnold realized that if Germany could secure forward bases, if they could turn the Atlantic islands into unsinkable aircraft carriers, the distance to Washington, D.C. would drop from impossible to routine. The only thing stopping a German invasion wasn't the ocean, it was the Royal Navy and the RAF holding the line in the North Atlantic. But what if that line broke?
To understand the gravity of the threat General Arnold faced, you have to look at the machines themselves. The Amerikabomber project wasn't a propaganda tool, it was an engineering marvel driven by desperation and ideological fury. Hitler didn't just want to defeat the American military, he wanted to break the American psyche. He believed that the United States was a mongrel nation, a fragile society held together by consumerism and Jewish capital. He was convinced that if the Luftwaffe could turn the skyscrapers of Manhattan into towering infernos, if he could bring the firestorm of London to Fifth Avenue, the American public would panic and force their government to sue for peace. The designs submitted to the RLM were terrifyingly capable. The Messerschmitt Me 264, often called the Adolf Hitler tank of the sky, was essentially a flying fuel tank. It carried so much aviation fuel that its initial takeoff weight was over 120,000 pounds. Its 4 engines could drag it through the air for 40 hours without refueling. But the real danger lay in the logistics. Flying from France to New York and back was at the very limit of 1940s technology. The payload would be small, perhaps only a few thousand pounds of bombs, a nuisance raid, not a city killer. However, the German strategists, particularly the visionaries in the Luftwaffe, like General Erhard Milch, saw a different path. They looked at the map, they looked at the Azores, they looked at Iceland. If Germany could seize the Azores, an archipelago sitting in the middle of the Atlantic, the math changed instantly. The flight distance to New York would be cut by a third. From bases in the Azores, a fleet of Heinkel HE-277 heavy bombers could not only reach the American East Coast, but they could also loiter. They could carry heavier payloads. They could drop the Fritz X guided weapon, the world's first smart weapon, onto the decks of American battleships docked in Norfolk. General Arnold had nightmares about this specific scenario. He knew that in 1942, the U.S. East Coast had almost no effective air defense network. The radar coverage was spotty at best. The interceptor squadrons were flying outdated P-39s and P-40s that struggled at altitudes.
If a flight of German heavy bombers appeared over Manhattan at 30,000 feet, there was very little the Americans could do to stop them. Imagine the psychological impact. It's 1943, you're a stockbroker on Wall Street. The war is supposed to be thousands of miles away. Suddenly, air raid sirens, a sound you associate with newsreels of London, start wailing over lower Manhattan. You look up and see the contrails of foreign bombers. The first bombs don't hit military targets, they hit the psychological heart of the nation. The Chrysler Building, the Brooklyn Navy Yard, Times Square. This was the New York plan. It was real. The prototypes flew. The pilots were trained. The maps were drawn. In our timeline, two things stopped this nightmare from becoming reality. First, the resource drain of the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union starved the Luftwaffe of materials. Second, and most importantly, the British Isles remained an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the Allies. As long as Britain stood, the Kriegsmarine was bottled up in the North Sea, and the Luftwaffe was forced to fight a defensive war over the Channel. Britain was the cork in the bottle. It was the breakwater that held back the tidal wave. But history is fragile. The survival of Britain in 1940 wasn't inevitable. It was a miracle. It hinged on the will of a single man, Winston Churchill. In May 1940, as the French army collapsed and the Wehrmacht rolled toward the coast, the British War Cabinet was split. There were powerful voices, sane, rational voices, arguing that the war was lost. They wanted to negotiate. This is where our timeline splits. This is where the cork pops. In our history, Churchill outmaneuvered the appeasers. He rallied the nation with blood, toil, tears, and sweat. But in this timeline, the pressure is too great. The logic of survival outweighs the rhetoric of defiance. Let's go back to May 26, 1940. The Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. The smoke is thick. The mood is funereal. And Winston Churchill is about to lose the argument.
The date is May 28, 1940. The British Expeditionary Force is trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk. The sea is calm, but the air is filled with the scream of Stukas. In London, the War Cabinet is in its third day of crisis meetings. In our reality, Neville Chamberlain, the former Prime Minister, sided with Churchill, silencing the calls for peace. But in this timeline, Chamberlain's resolve cracks. He looks at the map, at the swastika spreading like ink across France, and he sides with Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, who believes that negotiating with Hitler is the only way to save the British Empire from total annihilation. Churchill is outvoted. He is forced to resign. Lord Halifax becomes Prime Minister. On June 1, 1940, the BBC interrupts its broadcast. A solemn voice announces that an armistice has been signed. The Halifax peace is a masterstroke of German diplomacy. Britain retains its empire and its navy, but it must withdraw from the continent, recognize German hegemony over Europe, and most critically, remain strictly neutral in all future conflicts. The guns fall silent across the Channel. The miracle of Dunkirk never happens. The soldiers are simply ferried home as prisoners on parole. For the United States, this is a geopolitical catastrophe. President Roosevelt is stunned. His strategy of supporting Britain short of war has just evaporated. The Lend-Lease shipments, the destroyers, the supplies, they all stop. Britain is no longer an ally. It is a neutral observer, forced by treaty to deny the U.S. Navy access to its ports. The Atlantic Wall doesn't get built in France. It gets built in the middle of the ocean. Without the British Royal Navy patrolling the North Atlantic, the German Kriegsmarine is unleashed. The U-boat pens aren't just built in Lorient and Saint-Nazaire. They are expanded. The German surface fleet, the Bismarck, the Tirpitz, the Gneisenau, no longer have to hide in fjords. They can roam the Atlantic at will, projecting power from the Arctic to the equator. In Washington, the mood shifts from concern to panic. The Two-Ocean Navy Act, designed to build a fleet capable of fighting Japan and Germany simultaneously, is bogged down in a terrified Congress. Isolationist politicians, led by figures like Charles Lindbergh, argue that with Europe lost, America must turn inward. Fortress America, they call it. They argue that provoking Hitler now is suicide. They slash military budgets, believing that non-aggression is the best defense. General Hap Arnold watches this with horror. He sees the strategic map clearly. The unsinkable aircraft carrier of Britain is gone. The buffer zone is gone. The Atlantic is no longer a barrier. It is an open door. And Hitler, now free from the annoyance of the RAF, turns his eyes west. He doesn't look at Russia yet. In this timeline, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact holds firm. The Soviet Union and Nazi Germany are content to divide the East between them. This frees up the entire might of the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe for a new objective. The New York plan is moved from the bottom of the stack to the top. The RLM gives Messerschmitt and Henkel a blank check. The timeline for the Amerikabomber is accelerated by 2 years. But before they can strike New York, they need stepping stones. They need to shorten the distance. And with the British Navy sidelined by treaty, 2 prizes sit in the middle of the Atlantic, ripe for the taking: Iceland and the Azores.
In our timeline, the British launched Operation Fork in May 1940, invading Iceland specifically to deny it to the Nazis. It was a polite, bloodless affair, but it was strategically vital. It locked the northern door to the Atlantic. In this timeline, the British stay home. Iceland, a dependency of German-occupied Denmark, declares neutrality. But neutrality requires a navy to enforce it, and Iceland has none. In June 1941, the German High Command activates Operation Ikarus. It begins not with an armada of battleships, but with the drone of tri-motor engines. A fleet of 50 Junkers Ju-52 transport planes, escorted by long-range Bf-110 fighters, descends through the gray cloud layer over Reykjavik. At the same time, 3 German destroyers glide into the harbor. The tiny Icelandic police force is overwhelmed in 20 minutes. There is no resistance. There is only the raising of the flag. Overnight, the geography of the war shifts. Germany now possesses an unsinkable aircraft carrier in the North Atlantic. Engineers from Organization Todd arrive within weeks. They don't build barracks. They build concrete runways capable of handling heavy bombers. Meteorological stations are set up to feed weather data, crucial for transatlantic flights, directly to the Luftwaffe. But Hitler isn't satisfied with just the north. He wants the center. He wants the Azores. The Portuguese archipelago sits less than 2,400 miles from New York City. In our history, the Allies pressured dictator Antonio Salazar to lease bases to the British. In this timeline, with Britain neutered and German armies sitting on the Spanish border, the pressure comes from Berlin. It is an offer Salazar cannot refuse. Under the guise of mutual defense, German U-boats begin refueling openly in the port of Horta. Then comes the Luftwaffe. They construct a massive airfield on the island of Terceira. General Hap Arnold, watching from Washington, sees the map turning red. The Atlantic is no longer a vast protective ocean. It has been bridged. The air gap, the area of the ocean previously safe from land-based air power, has vanished. By late 1941, the first prototype of the Messerschmitt Me 264 lands in the Azores. It is a beast of a machine, sleek and silver, dwarfing the support vehicles on the tarmac. Its crew poses for propaganda photos, pointing west. The American public is still debating isolationism. They are still listening to speeches about how Europe's war is not their problem, but the technology of war has outpaced their politics. Then, on a clear Tuesday in September 1941, the reality finally hits home. A lobster fisherman off the coast of Maine hears a low, thrumming sound. He looks up, way up. At 35,000 feet, a thin white contrail cuts across the blue sky. It is too high for any American interceptor to reach. It is too steady to be weather.
It is a Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor flying a reconnaissance loop from Iceland. It isn't dropping bombs, it is taking pictures. It is photographing the Bath Iron Works shipyards. It is mapping the coastline. The ocean is gone. The enemy is overhead.
The attack does not begin with a roar. It begins with a glitch on a radar screen at Camp Hero in Montauk, Long Island. It is June 22, 1943, a humid, stifling Tuesday. The radar operator, a young private from Queens, stares at the oscilloscope. He sees a cluster of blips, angels they call them, ghosting in from the northeast at 32,000 feet. He dismisses it as atmospheric interference. No aircraft exists that can fly that high, in that formation, from Europe. He is wrong. At 11:15 a.m., the air raid sirens in New York City begin to wail. For 2 years, these sirens have been merely a drill, a nuisance that paused lunch breaks. But today, the radio broadcasts cut out. The voice of Mayor LaGuardia comes on the air, his tone strict of its usual bravado. "This is not a drill," he says. "Take cover immediately." 10,000 feet above the cloud layer, Colonel Werner Baumbach, the ace of the Luftwaffe's bomber arm, looks down through the glass nose of his Me-264. He is leading Kampfgeschwader 100, the Viking wing. They have flown from the Azores, refueling in mid-air over the calm Atlantic using specialized milk cow tankers. Their target is not the Empire State Building. That is for the newsreels. Their target is the Brooklyn Navy Yard, the beating heart of American naval repair. The first wave of bombs whistle down. These are not standard gravity bombs. They are incendiaries mixed with high-explosive blockbusters designed to shatter windows and open buildings to the fire. The impact is seismic. The Brooklyn waterfront erupts. The USS Missouri, currently under construction, takes a direct hit to its dry dock, the scaffolding collapsing in a tangle of burning steel. But precision bombing from 30,000 feet is an imperfect science. The overs and unders drift into the civilian grid. The tenements of Fort Greene and Clinton Hill catch fire. The wooden water towers on the rooftops explode into steam. On the ground, it is pandemonium. New Yorkers, unlike Londoners, have no experience with the Blitz. There are no deep tube stations to shelter in. The subways are shallow and panic-inducing. People flood into the streets, looking up, paralyzed by the spectacle of their own destruction. General Hap Arnold is in Washington when the reports come in. He immediately orders the 1st Fighter Command to intercept. But here, the technological tragedy reveals itself. The American P-40 Warhawks and P-39 Airacobras scramble from Mitchell Field on Long Island. They claw for altitude, their engines screaming. But they hit their service ceiling at 25,000 feet. The German bombers are cruising at 32,000. American pilots watch helplessly as the silver formations pass overhead, untouchable. They fire their machine guns at extreme angles, the bullets falling harmlessly back to earth. It is a turkey shoot, but the turkeys are the ones on the ground. By sunset, the all-clear sounds, but the sky is black with smoke. 2,000 New Yorkers are dead. The Brooklyn Navy Yard is a ruin, but the psychological wound is far deeper. The invulnerability of America has been shattered. The stock market crashes the next morning. Panic selling grips Wall Street. Real estate values in coastal cities plummet to zero. And then the second phase of the German plan activates. They don't just bomb, they blockade. With the Azores as a base, German U-boat wolf packs don't just hunt in the open ocean. They set up a picket line stretching from Nova Scotia to Bermuda. They sink bauxite shipments from South America. They sink oil tankers from the Gulf. The East Coast begins to starve. Gasoline is rationed, then unavailable. The lights of Broadway go out, not because of a blackout order, but because the coal barges can't reach the Con Edison plants. And amidst this chaos, the spies return. This time, they don't land in rubber dinghies, they parachute in. Fifth columnists, sympathizers from the German-American Bund, which in this timeline was never successfully dismantled, begin a campaign of domestic terror. They cut telephone lines, they derail trains carrying troops to the coast. General Arnold realizes that he is fighting a war on 3 fronts: the sky, the sea, and the streets. He begs Congress for funds to build the B-29 Superfortress, the only plane that can strike back at the Azores. But the factories in Seattle are suffering from material shortages because the rail lines are sabotaged. America is a giant, but it is being hamstrung. It is bleeding from 1,000 cuts. And as the winter of 1943 sets in, the Luftwaffe drops leaflets over Washington, D.C. They don't demand surrender. They simply say, "We are coming back, and this time we are bringing the army."
The leaflet was not a bluff. It was a statement of intent. In Berlin, the planners at the OKW, High Command of the Armed Forces, knew that a full-scale occupation of the United States was impossible. The logistics of shipping millions of men across the Atlantic would bankrupt the Reich. But they didn't need to occupy the whole country. They only needed to break its will. They needed a prestige victory, a humiliation so profound that the American government would collapse from within. They targeted the Chesapeake Bay. In August 1944, the largest naval armada ever assembled by a European power leaves the Azores. It is led by the battleship Tirpitz and her sister ship, the Bismarck. But the real threat is the aircraft carrier Graf Zeppelin, finally completed and carrying a wing of navalized Stuka dive bombers. The American Atlantic Fleet, depleted by years of convoy battles and spread thin across 2 oceans, scrambles to meet them. But they are blind. The German radar jamming, projected from high-altitude U-290 surveillance planes, turns American radar screens into snow. On August 14th, the Battle of Chesapeake Bay begins. It is a massacre. The Graf Zeppelin's air wing catches the American fleet at anchor in Hampton Roads. It is Pearl Harbor, but on the East Coast. The battleship USS New York is capsized in the harbor, blocking the channel. The port facilities of Norfolk, the largest naval base in the world, are pounded into rubble by the 15-inch guns of the Bismarck, sitting just offshore. But the Germans don't just shell the coast, they land. Under the cover of smoke and naval gunfire, the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division drops onto the deltas of Virginia Beach. They aren't there to conquer Richmond. They are there to hold the beachhead, to plant the flag, and to film it. Combat cameramen run alongside the paratroopers as they storm the boardwalks, tearing down American recruitment posters and replacing them with occupation notices. General Hap Arnold, watching the disintegration of his defenses from the war room in Washington, less than 200 miles away, plays his final card. He authorizes the deployment of Project MX-409. These are the first operational P-80 Shooting Star jet fighters. They are experimental, dangerous, and untested, but they are fast. A squadron of 12 silver jets screams out of Andrews Air Force Base. They arrive over the Chesapeake in minutes, shocking the German pilots who are flying propeller-driven Bf-109s. For one brief, glorious hour, the Americans reclaim the sky. The P-80s tear through the Stuka formations. The Graf Zeppelin takes a hit. But it is too little, too late. The jets run out of fuel. The airfields they need to return to are being shelled. By nightfall, the Germans hold a 20-mile strip of the American coast. They have destroyed the Atlantic Fleet. They have shelled the outskirts of Washington, D.C. The Capitol dome is visible in their binoculars, glowing faintly against the burning horizon. Panic seizes the Capitol.
The Secret Service initiates Operation Weathervane, the evacuation of the president. In the dead of night, an armored train carrying Franklin D. Roosevelt leaves Union Station, heading west. The federal government is retreating. They are abandoning Washington for the safety of the Rocky Mountains. The image of the president fleeing his own capital breaks the American spirit. The governors of the New England states, terrified of being next, begin to open back-channel negotiations with Berlin. The United States begins to fracture. General Arnold stays behind. He stands on the roof of the munitions building, watching the flashes of artillery fire to the south. He knows the war is militarily over. The Atlantic is a German lake. The East Coast is a hostage. The invasion didn't need to reach the Mississippi. It just needed to reach the headlines. The fighting stabilizes into a tense standoff. The Germans don't push inland. They don't need to. They simply hold the coast, strangling the American economy, bombing cities at will, and waiting for the inevitable political collapse. And it comes, not with a bang, but with a treaty.